Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. U.S. Army helicopters providing air support for U.S. ground troops flying low to a staging area 50 miles northeast of Saigon. A marksman from the U.S. 9th Infantry Division is submerged except for his rifle as he crosses a muddy stream in the Mekong Delta south of Saigon on September 10, 1968. Viet Cong activists meet in the Nam Can forest in a secret gathering, wearing masks to hide their identities. This practice was a safety measure, as in the event of capture, the masks helped protect members of the organization from possible torture and interrogation. A Viet Cong guerrilla rowing through the Mekong Delta amid a mangrove forest stripped of leaves by Agent Orange. The once dense trees are now leafless due to the effects of chemicals used to remove vegetation and hinder the movement of the Viet Cong. American soldiers waiting for treatment after being wounded in combat in Vietnam. They were waiting for medical evacuation, often done by helicopters. Quick rescue was essential, as the jungles and flooded fields made transporting the wounded difficult. A Viet Cong soldier with his hands tied is about to be executed in broad daylight. Surrounded by South Vietnamese military, he keeps a fixed gaze while an officer prepares to shoot. Executions like this were common during the Vietnam War, especially against prisoners suspected of involvement with the Viet Cong. Combat boots scattered along the road near Saigon, abandoned by soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, who, in a desperate move, took off their uniforms to hide their status. As the fall of Saigon approached, many soldiers tried to disguise themselves to avoid being identified and captured. Helicopters from the 199th Light Infantry Brigade transporting South Vietnamese guards to the edge of a pineapple plantation. These rapid insertion missions were common during the Vietnam War, allowing troops to be strategically placed in hard-to-reach areas. A militia company in Thanh Tri practices shooting at aerial targets, firing at high-speed aircraft. Using combat techniques adapted to the war, the soldiers trained to attack enemy planes, which often carried out bombing or reconnaissance missions. A South Vietnamese soldier pointing his knife at a kneeling man suspected of being a Viet Cong. The conflict in Vietnam was marked by distrust and retaliation, where the line between civilian and combatant often blurred, making such scenes common in combat zones. American helicopters flying over the area during the My Lai massacre in South Vietnam. On that day, U.S. troops attacked a village, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Vietnamese civilians. The aircraft provided air support and transportation for soldiers on the ground. Soldiers operating artillery pieces near the A Shau Valley in Vietnam. This region was a strategic route used by North Vietnam to transport supplies and troops. U.S. forces conducted constant bombardments to try to disrupt this flow, but faced strong Viet Cong resistance. Civilians waiting for the bombings to end inside small air raid shelters spread across the city of Hanoi, North Vietnam. With the intensification of American airstrikes, especially during Operation Rolling Thunder, underground structures and improvised trenches were essential for protection. Hidden under dense vegetation, a camouflage tunnel used by the Viet Cong. Small and discreet, this passage allowed guerrillas to move undetected by enemy troops. These tunnels were covered with leaves, branches, and dirt to blend into the environment. An American soldier wearing a helmet with the handwritten phrase, "War is hell." Amid the chaos of Vietnam, many soldiers personalized their helmets with messages reflecting their thoughts about the conflict. Viet Cong soldiers advancing on a war tank approaching the end of the Vietnam conflict. With flags in hand and weapons ready, they head toward Saigon, about to take the city. Tanks supplied by the Soviet Union were crucial in breaking through the last South Vietnamese defenses. Soldiers from the 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, start a rock session surrounded by symbols of war, wooden bunkers, helicopters, and sandbags in July 1970. The soldiers were entrenched at Fire Base Catherine. U.S. Navy personnel pushing a helicopter into the sea in order to make room for more flights. In times of high evacuation demand, damaged or out-of-operation aircraft were pushed into the sea to clear space for new flights. Wounded American soldiers trying to withdraw through the difficult terrain of the Vietnamese jungle, supporting each other as they move under constant risk. Covered in mud and exhausted, they struggled to reach a safe point where they could receive treatment. A Viet Cong woman surrenders a captured American soldier in North Vietnam. Dressed in simple clothes, many women fought as guerrillas, sharpshooters, and scouts, surprising enemy forces with ambushes and unexpected tactics. Exhausted South Vietnamese soldiers sleep on a U.S. Navy troop transport, taking them back to the provincial capital of Ca Mau. The infantry unit had been on a 4-day operation against the Viet Cong in swamps in the far south of the country. A South Vietnamese soldier gesturing to a comrade during an intense battle on Route 4 in Tan An. Route 4, a vital route for troop and supply transport, was frequently targeted by Viet Cong ambushes, making battles in the region even more dangerous. Marines emerging from their trenches south of the demilitarized zone after a 3rd night of intense fighting against North Vietnamese troops. Exhausted and covered in mud, they prepare to continue the fight as they observe the wreckage of a downed helicopter. An explosion raises a cloud of smoke near the Perfume River, which cuts through the city of Hue during the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese forces, fortified inside the ancient imperial citadel, resisted American and South Vietnamese attacks for weeks. In the Mekong Delta, in December 1964, U.S. Army pilots from the Airborne Division transported South Vietnamese soldiers to land in a rice field. This operation was a rapid response to a Viet Cong attack on Army of the Republic of Vietnam ground units. This photo shows 3 armed Viet Cong guerrillas, symbolizing the strong female presence in the National Front for the liberation of South Vietnam. About 40% of the guerrillas and militia members were women. Many served as scouts, messengers, and medics, but also participated in direct combat. In the Ca Mau Peninsula, a wounded Cambodian guerrilla, after a bombing, is carried by Viet Cong fighters through a mangrove swamp to a field hospital. Hidden in dense vegetation, these improvised hospitals were essential for treating the wounded, far from American aerial surveillance. Viet Cong guerrillas facing the enemy head-on in the Mekong Delta in a direct and intense fight. The mangrove and river terrain offers cover for the guerrillas, who use ambush tactics, moving quickly through the dense vegetation. Vietnamese refugees crowding a ship, desperate to leave the country as North Vietnamese forces advance to take control of Saigon. Entire families carrying only the essentials try to escape the impending fall of the city, seeking safety in a new country. On the streets of the United States, citizens hold up signs and shout slogans in a protest for the end of the Vietnam War. Such marches became frequent by the late 1960s, driven by the growing number of casualties and the shocking coverage of the conflict. U.S. Marines advancing through rugged terrain near the demilitarized zone of Vietnam, fighting for control of the rock pile against North Vietnamese troops. This steep hill served as an observation post and artillery base for U.S. forces. U.S. Marines patrolling the coastal region near the demilitarized zone during Operation Thor. This offensive aimed to contain the advance of the North Vietnamese Army, which was moving south. On a search and destroy mission, an American soldier points a flamethrower at a house suspected of harboring Viet Cong. Tactics like these were used to eliminate enemy hideouts and supplies, but also resulted in the destruction of entire villages. Laotian guerrillas transporting supplies on elephants and by foot to North Vietnamese Army troops near Route 9 in southern Laos. During the attempt to intercept the Ho Chi Minh Trail by South Vietnamese and U.S. forces, guerrillas used alternative methods to ensure the flow of essential supplies. North Vietnamese Army soldiers crossing open terrain in southern Laos. This operation was a failed attempt by the South Vietnamese Army to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Young female guerrillas with grenades strapped to their belts pose for a photo right after preparing to fight against the invading Viet Minh forces in the Red River Delta in northern Vietnam. Caught in a sudden monsoon rain, a company of about 130 South Vietnamese soldiers moves downriver in sampans as they head toward an attack on a Viet Cong camp. Actress Carol Baker snapping her fingers for the sailors who applaud from the bridge while Bob Hope guides her on stage on the flight deck of the USS Ticonderoga. The event was part of one of many shows organized by Bob Hope to entertain American troops during the Vietnam War. American soldiers from the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment celebrating as they return to South Vietnam in late June of 1970. They drive a tank past a bullet-riddled sign on the northern border of Cottam, marking the end of a dangerous mission. American soldiers rushing up a hill to escape flames after an attack. The war escalated with the Tet Offensive, when North Vietnamese forces and Viet Cong guerrillas attacked American cities and bases. Among the rubble of their destroyed house, a Vietnamese family faces an American soldier interrogating them. Even without a home, they are pressured to answer questions about possible ties to the Viet Cong. Search and destroy operations often left entire villages in ruins, forcing civilians to flee or face suspicion. Captain Vernon Gill of the United States Special Forces holding the radio while trying to communicate with his base amid an attack by Vietnamese troops. In such conflicts, radio use was vital for requesting air support and informing enemy positions. Wounded soldiers are carried on top of a tank, improvised as an ambulance after the Battle of Hue in Vietnam. This confrontation was one of the most intense of the war. Without quick evacuation, armored vehicles were used to remove the wounded amid enemy fire. Amid a tense siege, an American soldier, with his face marked by the weight of war, pets a dog. During the Vietnam War, dogs were loyal companions, used in patrols and rescues, but also provided emotional support to soldiers. Vietnamese soldiers removing women from a burning village during the Vietnam War. Some were prostitutes living near military bases, providing services to soldiers. Frequent conflicts resulted in the destruction of villages, forcing the evacuation of residents. An American helicopter landing to rescue wounded soldiers after an explosion in southern Da Nang. The place was a strategic U.S. base, often targeted by Viet Cong attacks. Helicopters were essential for rescue missions, transporting the wounded from combat zones to hospitals. A soldier covered in mud, holding his camera as he tries to capture an image amid the chaos of the war in Vietnam. Many soldiers documented the reality of combat on their own, while photojournalists accompanied operations to document the conflict. U.S. Marines advancing through the streets of Hue during the Tet Offensive in early 1968. The city, taken by North Vietnamese troops, became the site of intense fighting, especially within the ancient imperial citadel, where enemies were fortified. On Hill 881, near Khe Sanh, in 1967, a U.S. Navy medic, after realizing that his friend was seriously wounded, ran under intense enemy fire, shouting, "I'll kill them all!" Fighting on the hills around Khe Sanh was brutal, with close combat and heavy artillery. Children crossing a canal in the Bao Tri area to protect themselves from a Viet Cong sniper in 1966. Bao Tri, located in South Vietnam, was a region of intense guerrilla activity, where ambushes and surprise attacks were common. Airborne troops advancing cautiously near Ben Cat during the monsoon season, after being out of contact with other units for 12 days. The heavy rain turned the terrain into a quagmire, making movement difficult and increasing the risk of Viet Cong ambushes. American soldiers trying to cross the entrance to a tunnel complex during Operation Oregon in the Thua Thien province. These tunnels, used by the Viet Cong, served as hideouts and escape routes. The dense jungle made the search dangerous, with traps and ambushes around the entrances. Soldiers from the 1st Air Cavalry carrying a wounded comrade toward a helicopter evacuation point during Operation Masher near Bong Son. This offensive was one of the largest of the war, aimed at weakening the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces in the region. American soldiers running after a huge explosion in Vietnam. Explosions like this were common, caused by bombings, landmines, or Viet Cong attacks. The unstable terrain and constant ambushes made every patrol risky, forcing troops to react quickly to avoid further casualties in combat. A soldier from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam under intense enemy fire. Crouched behind an improvised barrier, he holds his weapon while trying to protect himself from gunfire. South Vietnamese troops faced constant ambushes as they tried to regain control of areas occupied by the enemy. An American soldier with a fixed gaze on the horizon, wearing a helmet marked with the phrase, "Make war, not love," during the Vietnam War. Messages written on helmets were common among military personnel, reflecting humor, frustration, or even psychological challenges faced in combat. The last Americans and Vietnamese evacuated from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Chaos took over the streets below as the city was about to fall into the hands of North Vietnamese forces, marking the end of the Vietnam War. A woman suspected of being Viet Cong waits to be interrogated while holding a Russian rifle. Weapons provided by the Soviet Union and China were common among guerrillas, who used ambush and sabotage tactics against enemy troops. Soldiers from Delta Company, a tank unit attached to the 1st Squadron, 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, stationed at the Black Horse Base Camp south of Xuan Loc. Black Horse served as a base for mechanized operations, providing support for offensive missions against Viet Cong forces. New recruits undergo mandatory physical exams in Haiphong. In 1973, North Vietnam's voluntary recruitment system was transformed into a mandatory system, with all physically fit men being called up for military service. The North Vietnamese Army, which started with about 35,000 men in 1950, grew to more than 500,000. A Viet Cong guerrilla vigilantly watches in the Mekong Delta, positioned between the water channels. The Delta, a vast region of mangroves and rivers, provided perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare, allowing the Viet Cong to hide and carry out surprise ambushes against American and South Vietnamese forces. A Viet Cong woman pulling a heavy fishing net on the Mekong River, taking on a task traditionally performed by men. In an effort to support their communities and the Viet Cong forces, They adapted to the challenges of war, sharing the heavy workload. Viet Cong militia members separate the wreckage of a downed U.S. Navy aircraft on the outskirts of Hanoi. Capturing American equipment was a symbolic victory, showing resistance and skill in fighting against a superior military power. Viet Cong guerrillas guard a forward post on the Vietnam-Cambodia border, protected by poisoned bamboo punji stakes. These traps, sharp and hardened with fire, were strategically placed where enemy soldiers might step on them. Construction workers discuss repairs on the bombed Ham Rong Bridge in central North Vietnam. The only route across the Ma River for heavy trucks and machinery, the bridge was heavily defended, and several U.S. planes were shot down nearby. Viet Cong troops traveling the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Truong Son Mountains, a network of routes extending for 750 miles along the western border of Vietnam. Known as North Vietnam's logistical backbone, the trail was used to transport supplies south through mountainous, densely forested terrain. Elderly Vietnamese, one from the north and the other from the south, embracing each other emotionally after the end of the Vietnam War. In 1975, with the fall of Saigon and North Vietnam's victory, the country was reunified, but the trauma of the war continued to impact its generations for a long time. Vietnamese civilians climbing the U.S. Embassy wall in Saigon as the city is about to fall. With North Vietnamese forces advancing, desperate civilians try to escape the impending communist victory, seeking a shred of safety. Explosions on the Newport Bridge on the outskirts of Saigon as South Vietnamese soldiers and Western cameramen run for cover. The bridge, a strategic transport point, was vital for troop and supply movement, becoming a prime target during the final advance. A wounded American soldier, while fighting against the Viet Cong, is being removed from the battlefield with his face bandaged, being guided by another soldier. By the end of the conflict, the United States had lost around 58,000 combatants. Refugees from Da Nang City using an improvised net to board a ship during the city's evacuation. The operation, which involved the removal of about 6,000 refugees, took 8 hours due to the large number of people trying to escape the impending fall of the city to North Vietnamese forces. A young person holding a weapon and the flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government in a street in Saigon after the city was taken by North Vietnamese forces in 1975. The flag, a symbol of communist victory, represents the reunification of Vietnam under the control of the communist regime. Orphans aboard the first flight of Operation Baby Lift, which aimed to evacuate 2,000 children from Saigon, just days before the North Vietnamese victory. The children, many of them war orphans or separated from their families, were transported to the United States and other countries to ensure their safety before the fall of Saigon. U.S. President Gerald Ford, his Secretary of State, and Vice President discussing the evacuation of Saigon in the Oval Office of the White House during the final weeks of the Vietnam War. The meeting takes place amid the growing chaos in Saigon as North Vietnamese forces approach the city. In April 1975, in Saigon, young protesters threw sticks and stones at riot police, expressing their frustration and opposition to the growing threat of North Vietnamese forces. Peter Arnett, Associated Press correspondent, north of Saigon during the final days of the Vietnam War, capturing images and reports. The Vietnam War was the first war to be widely televised, bringing brutal and realistic images of the conflict into the homes of Americans and the rest of the world. The last 3 employees of the Associated Press office in Saigon, along with members of the Viet Cong, on the day the South Vietnamese government surrendered. AP journalists were among the last to document the city's final collapse, with North Vietnamese forces entering Saigon and the reunification of the country being completed. U.S. citizens after leaving Saigon during the final evacuation. The evacuation of the city is remembered as one of the most chaotic moments of the Vietnam War, with thousands of civilians and allies trying to escape as North Vietnamese forces advanced. A U.S. doctor carries an injured child away from the battle in Hue. The child was found wandering between North Vietnamese and American gunfire the previous night in an extremely dangerous area. U.S. soldiers demonstrate a rare moment of compassion by giving water to an injured Viet Cong during combat in Vietnam. The soldier, with an attentive gaze, offers water to the prisoner, who was exhausted and dehydrated after days of fighting. South Vietnamese and American soldiers retreat completely in Saigon as North Vietnamese forces quickly advance to take the city. Amid the chaos of evacuation, troops try to organize themselves among a crowd of desperate civilians, all trying to flee the imminent fall of the city. An American soldier poses for a photo with Vietnamese civilian refugees. The soldier tries to offer a minimum of safety to the refugees who lost their homes and many loved ones amid the uncertainty and destruction. The freed prisoner of war, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sturm, is warmly welcomed by his family at Travis Air Base in Fairfield, California. After years of captivity in the hands of North Vietnam, Sturm returns to the arms of his loved ones, visibly emotional. While thousands of anti-war demonstrators rioted in the streets of Chicago during the Democratic National Convention, President Lyndon Johnson and his family watched the chaos from their ranch. The protests became a point of tension in the country, with violent clashes between demonstrators and the police. South Vietnamese troops, accompanied by U.S. advisors, moved through the dense vegetation around the city of Binh Gia. The Viet Cong attack they were waiting for did not occur, but anxiety and exhaustion are visible on the faces of the soldiers. American soldiers fighting through elephant grass while trying to carry an injured soldier on a jungle stretcher to the helicopter in Mê Mot, Cambodia. The evacuation took place during the U.S. incursion into Cambodia, a military operation aimed at attacking North Vietnamese bases. A soldier from the 1st Cavalry Division throws a basket of rice into the flames as his unit sweeps a village near Tam Khai. A peasant tried to save the basket from the burning house, but U.S. troops were determined to destroy anything that could be valuable to the Viet Cong. A U.S. paratrooper, wounded in the Battle of Hamburger Hill, grimaces in pain while waiting for medical evacuation at a base camp near the Laos border in May 1969. Buddhist monks and women pull a barbed wire barricade that had been set up in front of the Giak Minh Pagoda in Saigon to block a demonstration. Police wielding nightsticks injured at least 50 people during the protest. Associated Press photographer Horst Voss, with his cameras hanging around his neck, accompanies U.S. troops in the war zone, capturing images of the brutal reality of the Vietnam War. Known for his courage and dedication, Voss ventured into the front lines, documenting intense and often risky moments. American infantry soldiers crowd into a bomb crater full of mud, looking up at the tall jungle trees for Viet Cong snipers during a battle in Puoc Vinh, northeast of Saigon, in the Vietnam War Zone D. In 1963, journalist Peter Arnett, an Associated Press correspondent, posed with the equipment he carried while covering the Vietnamese army. With his camera and radio gear, Arnett was prepared to document the reality of the conflict in Vietnam, often going to the front lines. Morley Safer, the CBS correspondent. He was one of the most notable journalists of the time, known for bringing the raw reality of the conflict into American homes, including a memorable broadcast from 1965 showing the destruction caused by napalm attacks. In 1966, William Porter, Deputy Ambassador to South Vietnam, and Barry Zorthian, Information Minister Advisor in Saigon, pose in the White House Cabinet Room. During this time, the war was intensifying, and the U.S. administration sought support to justify its intervention in South Vietnam. The team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service by publishing the Pentagon Papers. This set of confidential documents revealed the extent of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and exposed government distortions regarding the war. General Vo Nguyen Giap, commander of the Communist Viet Minh forces. He employed guerrilla tactics and strategic sieges and was a central figure in the Vietnam War, leading Communist forces during the fight against the United States. U.S. Marines in an M48 tank in Vietnam, preparing to advance into enemy territory. The M48 tank, one of the main armored vehicles used by the United States during the Vietnam War, was essential in battles. Some members of the 25th Infantry Division gather around a guitarist. Music, often accompanied by improvised guitars, provided temporary relief from tension and fear, creating camaraderie and helping the Marines maintain morale. A soldier from the 1st Air Cavalry Division marked the months on his helmet while participating in Operation Pershing near Bong Son. The practice of marking the months on the helmet was a way for soldiers to track time and reflect on the challenges faced during the months of combat. A Marine from the 4th Regiment walks cautiously through a ravine filled with punji traps made of sharp bamboo stakes. Punji traps were a common tactic used by the Viet Cong to wound soldiers, causing intense pain and disrupting the unit's progress. Soldiers keep their weapons dry while crossing a muddy hole during a search mission with the 5th Marine Regiment, 19 kilometers southwest of Da Nang. Soldiers resting near a combat bunker with a sign saying, "Home is where you dig," during Operation Worth. This operation was marked by intense fighting, and soldiers were often exposed to attacks and extreme conditions. Members of U.S. Navy SEAL Team 1 descend the Bassac River in a SEAL Team assault boat during operations south of Saigon. Equipped with weapons and navigation gear, the SEALs carried out reconnaissance, sabotage, and combat missions against Viet Cong forces. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower greeting South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem at the White House. During the meeting, the two presidents discussed ways to protect South Vietnam, which was threatened by the spread of communism. General Creighton Abrams shakes hands with General William Westmoreland upon arriving in Saigon to take on a crucial role in commanding U.S. military operations in the country and helping coordinate military operations at a critical time in the war. Richard Nixon and South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu say goodbye at Midway Island Airport after a conference on the Vietnam War. The meeting aimed to discuss U.S. strategy and the future of South Vietnam. In 1970, Richard Nixon points to the area of Vietnam and Cambodia on the map, outlining the military operation aimed at destroying North Vietnamese and Viet Cong bases along the border. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, in a press conference in 1967, conveying optimism about the war's progress and justifying the gradual destruction strategy against enemy forces. A group of opposition National Assembly deputies using torches to set fire to photos of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu during an anti-governmental protest on the steps of the National Assembly building in Saigon. Just before the end of the Vietnam War, Crowds of Vietnamese desperately climbed the U.S. Embassy wall in Saigon, trying to reach the helicopter boarding zone, where they hoped to be evacuated. 2 military police officers assist a fellow injured MP at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon during the start of the Tet Offensive. This offensive was a large surprise attack launched against several cities in South Vietnam, aiming to destabilize the South Vietnamese government and its allies. U.S. Army helicopters fire machine guns into the tree line to cover the advance of South Vietnamese ground troops as they attack a Viet Cong camp 18 miles north of Tay Ninh, near the Cambodian border. A Viet Cong woman cries in despair after losing her husband amid the conflict. The war spared neither civilians nor combatants, leaving families devastated and marking generations with suffering and sacrifice. Women from the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam prepared traps in an open area in Vietnam. These tactics were essential in the guerrilla warfare against American and South Vietnamese troops. Using simple materials, they created sharp stakes, improvised mines, and camouflaged holes to hinder enemy advancement. A Viet Cong prisoner being interrogated by South Vietnamese and American soldiers. Such interrogations were common as Viet Cong blended in with the local population, making their identification difficult. Many prisoners were subjected to intense pressure to reveal details about ambushes and hideouts. During the Vietnam War, about 5,000 dogs served alongside 10,000 American dog trainers. These units played a crucial role, detecting traps, tracking enemies, and protecting patrols, saving about 10,000 lives. In mid-1969, Life magazine published a shocking edition showing photos of American soldiers killed in combat during just 1 week in Vietnam. With names, ages, and young faces, the publication revealed the harsh reality of the war to the American public. A young American soldier smiles while reading a letter from his family. Amid the conflict, letters were one of the few connections with the life they left behind. For many soldiers, these messages were an encouragement to endure the challenges of war and maintain hope of returning safely. Soldiers carry a wounded comrade through a swamp, struggling against the treacherous terrain and muddy water. The weight of the load and the difficulty of the environment make the task even more exhausting, but necessary to save a comrade's life.